All right, so as mentioned overhead and probably already in the top of your minds, we're looking at the next part in our study of the very best love song. I think it's important for us to pay attention to the various ways that this particular part of literature from the Old Testament is considered. I know a lot of times we see the introductory sentence where it reads, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, and that usually is why we'll have a heading or a title that says the Song of Solomon, as opposed to how it is rendered in some cases, Song of Songs. And we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight, a little bit more in detail about how we approach it and questions about the human author that's connected to the divine message that's contained within it, and how does that impact our understanding of it. With that being said, though, I want to begin tonight by opening up our minds a little bit and think about this type of interaction on the human level. So there is a couple in history, which is Robert and Elizabeth Browning. Elizabeth lived from 1806 to 1861, and in the course of their courtship, it produced a massive transformation in her life. We don't need to know the whole story, but it's important to have a couple of key details to understand the poetry that comes from the relationship, because it helps us understand this poetry too. So in her life, she lived in a very controlling household. She suffered from ill health, and because of a specific injury received, she thought she would never walk. Her relationship with Robert changed all of those things for her, and their courtship is actually the groundwork for the poetry that produced sonnets from the Portuguese, which is a literature gem if you want to dig into some poetry of a different style. But what we see in a lot of her work is this simple truth. Praise has the power to change a person's life. And you see that in the message of that chunk of poetry from their courtship. And within that, there is in her sonnets, the first one, describes the transformation power of love as it made a difference for her in a very specific way between life and death. And one of those sonnets goes like this. I saw in gradual vision through my tears, the sweet end years, the melancholy years, those of my own life who by turns had flung a shadow across me. Straightway I was sure. So weeping, how mystic shape did move behind me and drew me backward by the hair. And a voice said in mastery while I strove, guess now who holds thee? Death, I said, but there. The silver answer rang, not death, but love. In that sonnet, she is really trying to get to the emotive center of how significant both of those emotions were on the transformation of who she was and who she is. Remember, in our study of the text of Ecclesiastes, one of the common themes of there is hibble, translated into English, vanity or emptiness. And there is a consistent theme that nothing is worth everything is bad, it's so bad, why are we even trying? Until, in the latter half of Ecclesiastes, in the last few chapters, God is on the stage. And that shifted everything, because now there was purpose, and now there was meaning, and now there was sense. And that shifted our understanding of death. Death shifts, no longer as an adversary, but as a transformative moment. And the same thing is true about love, especially in the context of someone who is being impacted positively by love in a way that she's no longer feeling like there's no value or worth. There's no end in that sense of, oh, it's just awful. Because there is actually something to look forward to. And it has such a deep grip on her that it has the same power that death can hold over us and the fear of death. And so that sonnet expresses her emotions and her husband's emotions, her relationship's emotions, but much in the same way as the text of the Song of Songs does. Because there's a couple of great truths, and we've identified some of that. one of the things that we'll see significantly in this particular section, chapter 1, verse 1, all the way into chapter 2 and verse 7, is the way they perceive each other. You ever meet someone in the public sphere and you never meet their spouse, but you just assume by the way they talk about their spouse that their spouse is worthless? Because the only things you hear are how bad, horrible, lazy, they can't cook, they can't clean, they can't work hard. You ever meet a person like that? Yeah. You ever been on the receiving end of that information from a friend or a family member where they met your spouse, your friend, and they didn't know that ahead of time, but then you find out later that that's how they see you? How does that change how you feel? Do you feel less or more if you learn that someone you love or you think loves you thinks so little of you that they can't praise you and there's nothing praiseworthy? So if we can understand that that has that kind of crushing impact, how powerful is it then that we're given this window into a relationship to see that they love each other? They delight in seeing one another. And more so, their praise is consistent and specific. If you want to use more common terminology, you can see the butterflies in their eyes. You can see the delight, as the text will say in a couple other ways, and they're enthralled with one another. And yet there's a boundary, because the text will close in our segment here, to not awake love before its time. And so the boundary that's there is in the boundary of relationship and emotion up until it crosses over into the realm of a marital consideration. And so there's that powerful space in the text. Second question, as we kind of bring this point to its conclusion to begin the reading and examination of the text. When you were reading Song of Songs, how did you read it? Were you sitting at a desk like I often am when I'm reading my Bible? Or did you step outside on the porch? Or out with the squirrels that we were talking about before our assembly began? Here's something to try. It's the same thing as maybe having the Bible read to you. Go to a new spot with our next Bible reading and try to read it like it's poetry, because it is. Read it with your coffee in the morning, your tea in the morning. Read it in a context that matches the picture. And so if you can be outside looking at the leaves and the trees and the garden of creation, this will actually have a slightly different feel to it. And if the weather's bad tomorrow, and it could be, you got a window. So at least kind of look out there and perceive this message in that way, because there is a lightness to the message. Do you notice when you're reading through it that unlike Ecclesiastes and unlike Job, it's written not so heavy in its tone and its translation? Job is really thick, and the word structure and the concepts are intentionally, it seems, heavy. Where all these poems that are linked together, they're not. They are concise or precise, like the Proverbs, but they're a window into a heart that is being wound together with their beloved. And that's a term or a phrase that's going to appear a couple of different times in the way in which it kind of unfolds. Further, it's important for us to remember right now as we look into the text a little bit is to pay attention to what we've got here. I mentioned it briefly in our look at the text last Wednesday night, and I'll kind of double down a little bit. The structure of the Song of Songs, the very best love song, isn't exactly linear. We like things to have a beginning, middle, and end, right? Like I want that, let me say I like to have a beginning, a middle, and end. I want to have those things. And within the beginning, middle, and end, I want road signs that tell me exactly what's next. Even if it's a surprise road sign, I still want to know kind of where I am. That there's going to be a resolution. And I want the pieces to feel like they fit together in a way that sometimes makes sense to me. Song of Songs isn't necessarily structured that way. As I read through it, it is looking over a longer courtship, then parts of the marital moments, and then discord and reconciliation. But they're not one right after the other in the sense of this day, that day, the next day. It's this time, something else happens. An unspecified amount of time takes place, and then something has changed, and so on. And there's some other voices, and we mentioned them last week too. What are some of the other voices besides our literary king, who probably isn't the Solomon of the Old Testament kings, but is written as being royal, and is written as being someone who is wise and beautiful in his appearance in some ways. But who else is in there besides him and the Shulamite or the Israelite woman? Who else do we have in this text? There's one group we've already mentioned. Well, that's the second one. Daughters of Jerusalem and her family. Her brothers are mentioned too. So in her family, it seems that there is some familiar connection that comes in the text too. But then there's the daughters of Jerusalem. There's the other nobles. There's the rest of the groups around them. And the literary form will bring in soldiers and other parts of the community. But they're always secondary players. The daughters of Jerusalem choral group has some important things to say. And then her brothers will have some important things to say. But they're secondary. Is that pretty practical? Is that kind of what happens in relationships? For the folks that you know that have gone recently through the dating phase, do they call other people on time? Or do they lose track of time and ignore everybody around them? I'll speak from my side of the thing, that in that phase for me, it was I lost track of time and I ignored everybody around me, because that's pretty normal. That's how the text also kind of, even though there's no structure, you do see that. They are the center of their worlds. I think there's an importance in understanding that as well. Further, all of the forms of literary interaction are on this table here. So metaphors, allegories, all of that is going to be used here. And sometimes it's going to be obscure to us, mainly because the imagery that's been translated has been given a literal flair when maybe more narrative interpretation will help us see it. And we'll catch some of that as we read through it. We're going to read a part of the text incrementally tonight too. We'll kind of bounce back and forth between some of y'all reading it and me reading it, mainly for clarity, but there's going to be some reading that takes place. And so we'll work through that as well. So before we get into the context of the scriptures themselves and kind of pay attention to the words, any questions about any of that? Michael?
I have a question to comment about when you asked how did we read. And I was thinking about yesterday, I read it on a computer screen at work, and I had to think about how I really drive things on a computer screen. When we read, there's no tone of voice. But literally by reading it out loud, we can get a tone of voice. It makes it so much easier to really feel like what you're reading if it's in a surrounded. It's not a blank computer screen. Like Sunday when Gary talks about Jesus come back in the clouds in the sky. And I look up and there's all these massive clouds. So our surrounding can drastically affect, absorbing what we're reading.
Yeah, and we will not do this, but you could, and it has been done. When you were probably in school, you were probably forced to read a play in your English classes where everyone was assigned a part. You can do that with this particular work more so than any other part of the Old or New Testament because it's written that way. It's written in voices, and so there's a dialogue back and forth. We're not going to do that here for a lot of reasons, but it's something that you can do. So, digging in the text. And by the way, it's not just the coldness of the text on the screen there. Get that printed page out from time to time in your physical Bible that you love. And if you're confident in who you are, get out in the field somewhere and present it out loud. Give yourself a little poetry reading. It really actually can shift the way you understand the text, even though you might look a little strange to the people around you. You make your call on which one you're comfortable with. All right, so I'm going to read a bit from chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, and kind of move our way through. And Michael, do you feel like reading some tonight? So, Michael, do you want to pick up, and I'll read through verse 7, and then we're going to talk about that chunk for a second. But can you get ready verses 8 through 14, and then we'll see where we are on the timeline, see how much time we have? All right, so Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 1. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is oil poured out. Therefore virgins love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. We will exult and rejoice in you. We will extol your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you. I am very dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. But my own vineyard I have not kept. Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself besides the flocks of your companions? One of the key things you see in this first 8-verse chunk is the plainness of the affection. There is no subverting or hiding the interest that is being demonstrated here. And it is presented in an open way. Now, there's something important about the way our Bibles work that we sometimes lose. And I use a little phrase lately that we use translations that have the skirts of Puritans on them. Puritan history kind of takes anything that seems on the edge of immodest and extra double downs, and like adds 4 layers of ruffles and hides all of it. And so it happens in at least 2 ways in the Bible. Way number 1 is with language. Whenever there's a word that could be translated in a more guttural or direct phrase, it gets really softened by gentle euphemisms, even in some of the most literal translations of the Bible. Like, say, the New American Standard or the American Standard. They'll soften it up, and they'll find a less edgy term. But that less edgy term may move the meaning way away from the intent of the phrase. So that's one thing that happens. And it happens some in this text too. The second one comes in part from our own inability to accept the natural relationships that God built between husband and wife, man and women, because of the nature of our experiences. The challenges that come to the table because maybe in our upbringing, maybe we can use the term our family of origin, rather our family of faith, there were dynamics that fall in the realm of abuse, neglect, misunderstanding, poor guidance, no leadership. And so our perception of a human relationship is very skewed because of that. And so that's one possibility. Second possibility is false doctrine that was taught to us at some point that we've had to undo or are in the process of undoing. These are illustrations of things that then warp our willingness to understand that God built this relationship in a healthy way. And the Song of Songs, the best of all the love songs, tries to get us to understand it. Even if, by the way, we're looking at this as an allegory for Christ, the church, Israel, and God, all of this physical understanding that's given here has to be understood first for the allegory to mean anything. There has to be a literal side for it to make sense on the figurative side. Much in the same way that the allegory between Hagar and Sarah exists in Paul's writing in Galatians, much in the same way as Paul is able to talk about husband and wife, talk about Christ and the church. It has to be true about the husband and wife for it to be true about Christ and the church. So this has to be true about the relationship for it to be true about Israel and God or Christ in the church. We're going to use those other methods or concepts. So, with that as a little bit of background, did you notice that there are things that seem to be in the category of we don't talk about that in public in the way that the text was written? I'm not going to make anyone raise their hand and say, well, this is uncomfortable. But literally, there is that. And here's something to think about. That's not a bad thing, because it's actually defining the nature of a specific personal relationship. And it's especially important to recognize that it is a personal relationship when it's about you and your beloved, or even the principle here. But when we read it in this form, it's not about a person you know. Most of the people who this was originally about, they're no longer walking this side of the veil. And so we're looking back into history here and seeing their appreciation for one another. But it can also help us understand how we can interact now. And so these are things that can be benefits to us, blessings to us, if we're willing to understand them in a proactive way. So there's some of that there. Is there anything, before I kind of walk through the 7 verses really quickly, that was of interest to you, or you didn't understand the word play or the word form? There was a phrase used and you're not quite sure what it means. Anything that fits in that category now or later, by the way, you can always raise your hand and ask. Yeah. There's an obvious literary and literal contrast between our hero and our heroine. He is a king. He is in the court of kings. He is wealthy. She seems to be from the far reaches of the community around her. She's working in the vineyard, which would not have been the case for a king. Even the reference to his flocks is royal in context. Here's the comparison. For Egypt, their kings were all farmers. And if you look at all of the Egyptian history about them, they're always having farm implements around them. But you look at the Hebrew king, they are all shepherds. All of their imagery is about shepherding. And so this is again a callback to his royal status, that his flocks are the king's flocks, and his companions are his lords, and it's their flocks. And she is drawing toward that relationship. There's a contrast being made between how she sees her love and its comparison to wine. Does that seem a little weird? Well, it does, especially in the context of our understanding of how we perceive wine right now. The wines that we're familiar in American context typically fall into a fortified group, which are increased alcohol for the most part. Nearly all wine that's available as a table wine in the U.S. is created and curated in a way to increase its alcoholic content. We don't have a spectrum of wines. We've got grape juice and alcoholic wine, nothing in the middle. Where in Hebrew language, and in the context of the Old Testament, their spectrum of available things is a lot smoother. And so you've got the freshest of the fresh. If you were to take the grape and squeeze it, that's that first pressing of the grape, they've got that. And they've got everything in the middle, all the way up to vinegar. And this word that's used here isn't determinant of that alcoholic content, because that's one of the 2 ways we judge wine in America. First way is it wine or grape juice? And then if it's wine, if it's alcoholic, then we've got this really complicated method of French/English/American quality groups. And we probably all stop and say, well, I just don't drink it because it's alcoholic, and so I have no reference. Remember, in their culture, there's a lot more fluidity with that. And so whatever she's referring to is the best of the best. And she's saying, he's better than that. If you want a biblical picture, think about what Jesus made at a wedding feast and how surprising it was to the headmaster and how it caused everyone to believe. And here's the literary tie-in for you. They're at a wedding. That's where you read all your poetry. These are Hebrews. So what kind of poetry are they going to be thinking about at a wedding? Well, it's the Song of Songs, the love song of love songs. And he interacts with wine, demonstrating that he is God in their midst. So that's kind of a neat thing that takes place in the text here. Further, there is the desire to spend time with one another. Like they want to be around each other. They want to engage in one another's company. They want to really enjoy that relationship. There are going to be limits there, but they're seeking to that. And there's this sense that come across in the text, say in verse 3, your name is like perfume poured out. You think about it like just how wonderful it is to hear the name of your beloved. That's the basis of that poetry in that sense. Michael, do you want to read verses 8 through 14 real quickly for us?
You yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, go forth from the trail of the flock, and pasture as the young goats by the tent of the shepherd. To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads. We will make for you ornaments of gold with beads of silver. While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance. My beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh, which lies all night between my breasts. My beloved to me is a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of Engedi.
So you see kind of a shift here. One of the ones I wanted to point out, remember we mentioned pet names before? There's a return to that concept. He uses in verse 9, my darling. It's translated that way in a couple of our translations. In the ESV, it is my love. And it has all of those soft tones. Hebrew is not my language, and so you don't have to listen and suffer me in reading this in Hebrew. But it does have that gentle tone to it. And you also notice in the text here, as we kind of move into the deeper parts of it, he's making some comparisons that go beyond the nature of just Israel. He talks about her as being compared to a mare among the chariots of the Pharaoh. It's an interesting thing given the nature of the relationship between Israel and Egypt, but he is vaulting her above it. He's not making it equal. He's saying, you are better than. And in the context of the ancient Near East and the context of the world in which they lived in, she is now seen as superior to what would have been the greatest form of its kind. That was the best. And so he is better than fine wine, and she is better than the best hot rod. And you could kind of think about it in those terms. So whatever your favorite automobile was, guys, she is now compared to the higher form of it. He's lifted it up. So whatever that was, it's now superior to it. Text continues, and I want to make sure we include this chunk as well. This is going to be verses 15 of chapter 1 all the way through the 7th verse of chapter 2. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves. Behold, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly delightful. Our couch is green, the beams of our house are cedar, our rafters are pine. I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. As a lily among brambles, so is my love among the young women. As an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. With great delight, I sat in his shadow, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love, sustained me with raisins, refreshed me with apples. For I am sick with love. His left hand is under my hand, his right hand embraces me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. You may have noticed, at least chapter 2, verse 1, that's a part of this song that makes its way into other literature. What song does that appear in? And what's it about? That phrase? Lily of the Valley. It's talking about Jesus in that way. Does that match the context here? This is one of those yes and no things. Because it's about love, but not necessarily love in the way that we see it. This is where the allegory only makes sense if we've included an understanding of the physical relationship between man and women. And so with a picture of Jesus and that kind of love, that I want to spend all my time with each other, I want to be connected, I want to have a relationship that makes sense. But we don't necessarily see Jesus in the same way. That's a cautionary point. And maybe the way we understand some of the literature at times moves into our songs in a little bit of a malformed way. Maybe that's not the best use of that passage and verse, and maybe we can rethink it a little bit. I will say, though, that again, Song of Songs is a complicated text. There's a lot going on here. And so we're trying to understand literature in the context of its original writing in a way that makes sense. And so there's some edges that we may not necessarily catch. In chapter 2, verse 2, it shifts a little bit more. And you have the phrase where he, the man, is speaking to her, as a lily among brambles, so is my love among the young women. And there's a level of contrast in his speech. And she takes the compliment that was given, directed in his direction, turns it, and talks about her specialness, and everything else is less. And you can see the relationship continuing to move forward. Further then, the story rises, and there is a banner image brought up in chapter 2, verse 4, very similar to the tribes' banners that they used as they marched out going into the Promised Land. That same word is used here, that same idea. But basically, it's a giant sign that hovers over their relationship that says, we're together. We're interested in each other. And everybody knows because it's on display for all to see. And you may not catch it because it's a little bit hard to understand, but in the context of this time frame, her request for raisins and apples isn't just, I like raisins and apples, or it's the thing he's giving to me. It's actually an interplay because of her emotions. She's lovesick, and this settles her stomach. And that's a cultural thing that appears in a lot of contemporary poetry from this era. But this is their solution to it. You're all excited, and you're not together in the way that you want to be. Okay, settle your stomach. Calm the butterflies. And the food that she partakes seems to be the solution to it. Verses 6 and 7 is a sense of embracement. She takes a moment to tell us that he provides protection to her in that regard. And yet it doesn't go too far, but it does acknowledge something. Because remember, she is not from the same economic sphere as him. She's the Hebrew woman, the Shulamite woman. He's the king. His action here does two things. It solidifies their commitment to being interested in each other, but it also eases the tension of this relationship. She belongs. If you want to put it in like a 50s movie context, there's been the exchanging of the class ring and the Letterman jacket. If you want to put it in like a 21st century context, all of his sweatshirts have been stolen and are now in her closet. So that's like two different ways to understand the same truth, that this is demonstration that, yeah, she belongs, she's with me, she should be here, everything. And it's going to repeat. We'll see the same level of acceptance come in another section of the play of words back and forth. And then it closes in this part of it with this request. And she is speaking to the chorus, the daughters of Jerusalem, the people who would be in the courtier of the king. We can't allow things to go too far. If you want to look at it in a very practical term, they're not married yet. And so this is a boundary that they're placing, and it's a public boundary. But yet, did you notice that there was no denying between the two of them that they're attracted to one another? That there's an obvious understanding that that physical side is there. I think this is a practical point for us to do a few seconds of teaching about in regards to understanding human behavior and being good mentors to the people around us, and also understanding ourselves. It's very common in the teaching method, if you're talking about, say, the purity culture that was really popular about 15 years ago and has kind of died out, that you basically kind of demolished your desires down to not existing anymore, and you acted like it didn't happen. You didn't have any kind of desire. And then you further denigrated each other in ways that described yourself as, one of the ones that was the most caustic was someone who had engaged in rebellious behavior towards God and committed sin or fornication. They were like chewed gum. You just didn't want to chew it again. And here's the problem with that. It denies the reality of God's redemption. It also further demonizes a relationship that God cherishes. And it destroys the natural design that God has between husband and wife and beloved. And it's a lot healthier to acknowledge the desires and then put the right place and context on them rather than pretend like they don't exist. If they don't exist, all they're going to do is bite you when you're not looking. It's like acting like the stove's not on and it's not hot. And so then you can just put your hand on it. It's like, look, okay. No, the desire's there. And so I really respect the text that it deals with it openly here. That means that we should do the same thing in the ways that are appropriate to the point of life that we're in. And so if we're working with small children, well, their bodies haven't matured to the point where those desires are really even part of their content. And so we speak to them to their age. But when you get to, say, I don't know, post-high school, that's a great time to talk about all of that in more detail, but you can't skip the middle stage. From the developmental page to you're off in college and maybe you're now seeking a spouse, you've got to have some conversations in advance rather than having to reinvent the relationship when everything goes off the rails. And so there's a great sense of that there. But what do you guys see in the text here? When you read through it, when you think through it, we're going to talk about at the close of our time, the last 5 or 6 minutes, about how this impacts the theology that God's knowledge of our creation and his knowledge of us. But what do each of you maybe see or insights that you thought were important in the text that would be good for us?
There's a good pattern I express your love and appreciation for someone. But clearly, we got to change the word here. If I tell Kelly more than the Tesla, that's not going to fly.
I don't know. It might depend on the day. That might be a day-specific thing. But yeah, there's a level of the power of the poetry that makes sense for them. But then we personalize our context, because we're not writing love sonnets every day to one another. Not all of us are poets. We don't have to be. And nor does the other half of the relationship necessarily want poetry. They simply might want the laundry done, which is a poetry of its own. Each of those things have an interaction in a separate sense of studies with the needs that we have as human beings. And so what fits that relationship is a key component. Not just, well, I read it in Song of Solomon, and clearly that's the way that I should be doing things. No, it's a picture of the relationship in poetic form. And that poetry can give us insight into the desires and the relationship we're trying to build. So, Michael, they're exactly correct. We can't use the Tesla model or the 67 Shelby as a model of comparison, or a Ford pickup truck. Even though those are highly prized automotive endeavors for the male side of things. Then we have the female side of the poetry as well. What else? Other insights that we saw in the text, or questions you had? Did you guys look for any of those key markers besides the one pet name that I brought up? Remember from last week we had a moderate list of pet names and different things to kind of think about and consider?
People that you care about, it does them a lot of good for them to hear that. I'm sure they love hearing these things said to themselves. And we have to think about to make sure that people in our lives that we care about, that we let them know those things.
Right. If we expand the space between our thing, this is about the husband-wife relationship, male-female relationship, just talking about all relationships. There's great transformative power because of the praise, because of the really powerful focus that they have towards each other and towards their relationship and their commitment. And again, that bigger picture. Thinking about it on a theological sense, like what is God trying to teach us? If I take this text and I get the literal thing, and so if we really strip it down to the bones of the literal experience, and it's about courtship and boundaries, and it is. And then there's the application side to making sure that our courtship has real courtship but keeps boundaries in place and how that can be helpful to us. Remember this. In creation, whatever was necessary in creation was satisfied by the duality of the humanity that was built. It's presented to us in two different forms in Genesis 1 through 3. The first one is more just sequential, where they were made. The second look into it that starts in chapter 2 is a little bit more revealing in that it shows the incompleteness of man that is satisfied by the helpmeet of this woman. And their relationship is quickly complicated in the text because they move out of their intended relationship, it seems, and their curses force them into uncomfortable spaces. And so the curses that are given to Adam and Eve reflect their rebellion. Eve, who took the lead in speaking with the serpent, is cursed with submission. And Adam, who didn't take the lead, is cursed with leadership. And these are responses to the rebellion. The two participants in the story, we don't remember sometimes that they too, the real they too that this is written about, were like you and I. And they too had sinned and fallen short. And they too needed the sacrifices of God. And so their love story exists on top of that bigger biblical love story. And so whomever they were in the lead up to this, whoever they were in the background, their real relationship begins on top of what God accomplishes within them. And so never forget that God is still working here, as he is now, with a humanity like ours, that in absence of the redemption of Christ would still be longing for that part of our relationship to be satisfied and fulfilled. But because of Christ, it is. And in that phase, we can go forward. Because like I talked about in the beginning, and we'll double down again right now, a lot of the relationships we have in life are absolutely against the expectations of the Scriptures. There is the Bible's teaching, and then the culture that surrounds the Bible. And they're not always the same. A lot of the Old Testament is the moral standard is here, so the culture is down here. So it is now. The moral standard is here, but our cultures may be down here. And we would be coming into relationships, coming into a marriage, coming into life, coming into the transformation into the gospel from any number of those broken relationships that include male-female relationships that have not been healthy. Or maybe are a void, or maybe are a sense of brokenness, or maybe the relationship that we're seeking isn't being fulfilled in the way that God designed. And so this section of the text can also help us grapple with and understand it better, and really get a good insight into that. And so that kind of opens the stage for our deeper understanding. Any last questions before we close out for our study this evening? Bobby. Absolutely. There's a small portion of biblical literature that is obscure. Like, and here's another one that's really easy to understand, the material that's used to build the ark. Everybody says it's gopher wood. Nobody actually knows what gopher wood is, Because all that we're doing to get to gopher wood is that the word that's used in the original text, if we read it out loud, it sounds like gopher. And so it literally reads gopher. But nobody actually knows what gopher wood is. And so that's one of those areas where, closer to the event, they might have understood what gopher wood is. We don't, because we don't have a word to translate it. We know it's wood. That means it was a tree. Some of the things that are in here are a little obscure. Just remember this. I'll try very hard when it's really crucial to understand the poetry. I'm going to bring us some pictures so we have a better understanding of it. But generally, perfume's perfume, plants are plants, cedars are cedars, etc. And so there's a lot of similarity there. But some of them, like Bobby is pointing out, are challenging. And yeah, you're right. A closer appreciation of both the land and the language would strengthen the edges and nuances. But the general stuff is still there.